Hey everybody, this is Dr. Frank with the Church of Rational Truth. Today we are going to be talking a little bit about the morality of polygamy. But before that, a little bit of old business first. We had two options again for voting last week for the passive income. The two options were to go to reinvestment into the general endowment fund or to be going into the church fund for a physical church slash library. Votes are in, and the money is going to be going towards funding a physical library and church again. So we'll add that money in, and during the next update, we will see how much that is in the endowment. Gosh, my hair's all screwed up. But anyway, so main topic today that we're going to talk about is polygamy, and we're going to just use that interchangeable for polygamy, polyandry, polygyny, and is it moral or immoral, and how so? Like everything, big old disclaimer, it's relative. I'm not just going to say, "Oh yeah, it's completely immoral. Oh yeah, it's completely moral. Go and have fun. Go do whatever you will." We have to examine it. We have to evaluate it. And this one, I would say, is especially a case by case basis. The way I would split up the morality is into two different parks or two different groups of areas where you have to look at the specific morality. Um, just for simplicity's sake, because I think there's two distinct areas where you have to discuss the morality of a polygamous relationship. The one would be within the relationship itself between the individuals that are making up that relationship, and the other one would be within society as a whole in outside of that relationship, or how does that relationship affect society altogether. And you'd have to look at those two things to determine in a specific situation, is this something that is moral, immoral, and honestly, this is going to probably be quite complicated in any given situation. So I would start with, let's talk about just the relationship in general. Things we want to look for are harm. Is there coercion? Is this a fair relationship? Are the people entering into it of their own free will? Are they knowledgeable about this relationship? Are they wanting to be in this relationship? Are they happy consenting adults? Are they able to consent? Are they able to understand the implications of this relationship? Do you have something where someone is taking advantage of someone either younger, stupider, or not mentally capable of making this decision? Or do you have free adults who say, yes, this is a relationship I want to be in. I chose freely to be in this relationship and I'm happy with it. That is probably one of the big things with it. Is it done under duress? Is it done under unfair circumstances? Or is someone taking advantage of someone else because of the situation? Are they using whatever is going on in the world or whatever is going on in that society to their advantage that otherwise would not be fair in terms of having a relationship? Those would be the big things to look in within that relationship. And you're going to have to kind of tease those out. You're going to have to talk to the people in the relationship. Is the dynamic fair in that relationship? When you have multiple people, things get exponentially more complicated. Is everyone on equal footing in the relationship? Are people not on equal footing in the relationship? If you're going back to biblical times, are you going to have a main wife and concubines? Are you going to have a main husband and I don't know what the male equivalent of concubines are, but possibly also concubines. Are you going to have that and have someone be diminutive, someone underneath, or certain people who are at the higher status or possibly lower status? That has some implications. Is the person of a lower status in the relationship okay with being of that lower status, or are they kind of forced into that lower status? Um, versus having everybody equal. And then if everybody is equal, are people actually treated as equal, and how do you divvy that up? Do you have a method of divvying up equality? Do you have a voting system? Do you have a division of labor within the relationship? How are you handling things? That gets very complicated, and you have to look at it to see, is this fair? And even if it's not fair, honestly, just because something is fair doesn't mean it's immoral. Just because something is unfair doesn't mean it's immoral. So it could be an unfair division of labor, but there can be other reasons why someone might want to be in an unfair relationship because it has its own advantages to that person, or sometimes that is better than not having a relationship. So those are some of the big things that you have to look within the relationship itself, within the interrelationship dynamic, to see, is that dynamic actually moral, or are there things that are immoral going on in that relationship? Things like, are you gaslighting? Are you tricking? Are you abusing? Are you using, different powers that be to take advantage of other people or put them at a disadvantage within the relationship that they really would not want to on their own? That is one big section of it. I think the broader implication, though, with the morality of polygamy isn't as much with that relationship because you can get those issues with any relationship, whether it's polygamous, monogamous, or whichever. You're always going to have those issues of morality in the relationship. So that's really not as specific with polygamous relationships, but it is definitely much more complicated with polygamous relationships because you have multiple individuals involved, and that complicates things. The other side, which is probably more uh, important in terms of how society sees polygamous relationships, is how does that relationship affect the society as a whole? And I would say that very much depends on the values of the society, how much they are, I would say sexually liberal, but you could either see this as something that's sexually liberal or something very sexually conservative, depending on the viewpoint and the situations that are actually going on. Uh, is this actually helpful or harmful to society as a whole? If this is a point where, let's say, one person in a polygamous relationship is gaining so because they have so much power over others via sexual wealth, political, where they're able to get that polygamous relationship and then exclude others within the society from having relationships, that has some moral implications. That's probably more immoral because this person is using their, power and abilities to actually harm others and gain themselves. Now, you could argue, okay, well, maybe that is the benefit of that power, the benefit of that wealth, the benefit of that status, the benefit of that attractiveness, whatever thing that is allowing them to do that. But society, you are causing some negative. And you got to kind of say, okay, is the negative justified? Is it not justified? Are we creating more net negative than we would be by not allowing this relationship? That is one big aspect. The other aspect it would be is this a situation where this might actually be beneficial to society? And there are certain situations that you can see in the natural world with animals and with the regular world with people where these relationships might actually be of benefit depending on the individual circumstances within that society. One big example is a country that is war torn. Usually in war, you get a preponderance of male deaths. If you have a preponderance of male deaths and yet you still have a lot of females in that society, you're going to have a discrepancy between the sexes. And whenever you have a discrepancy between the sexes, you have to figure out what are you going to do in terms of marriage, pairing off, and having children. If you've got, you know, 100 females and 20 males left, you're going to end up either with 20 happy relationships and 80 people who are left out, or you're going to have to figure out, are you going to have some sort of polygamous relationship to save this? Or are you going to have a different system where, let's say, there is a changing of relationships where, let's say, every few years you change where the person, would switch to new partners? That's not really something that's very commonly done, but it is a potential solution to that situation other than just letting a large percentage of the population not have a relationship. Obviously, this goes both ways. I would say in history, war has been one of the biggest things because it is such a big thing that can cause a gender bias, especially very quickly and within one single generation. If you have a big war, you can easily wipe out 30, 40, 50% of a single gender of a small population, and then you cause a very big problem there. I would say you probably see this problem in the early 1900s and after the 1940s, 1950s, when you had World War One and World War Two. A lot of men were dying, not a lot of women were dying, and so now you've got this discrepancy. And this is probably also, I would say, if you're looking back in the old texts in the 1900s, is a lot of times where you'd see the stereotype of the oh gosh, not the widow, of the woman that's unable to get a husband, where you have to actually, and you saw this in the 50s too, where women would actually have to work hard to try to get a husband. And now that seems very abnormal because usually it's much more the other way around, that men have to try really hard to try to get a wife, and it's more switched the other way in terms of the gender biased and who's advanced in the relationship. Versus you go back to the 1950s and you see some old adverts, you see a lot of adverts on how to make myself appealing to a husband. And this also happened in the early 1900s, where not so much early, but the first half of the 1900s, where women were more of the I have to work to find a husband, because you get that gender imbalance. You see this sometimes in the opposite in some Asian countries, not going to list out specifics, but some Asian countries have a bias against female children, And so then they get the opposite in terms of a gender balance. They get a large amount of males that are actually looking for wives, but the problem is there's so few females, it's very hard to get an appropriate wife. There are stories from Nepal all the time with this happening from, I don't want to get into too many specifics, but let's just say stories of a country stealing women away from another country because they had so few of their own women that the way they solved it was not through polygamy, which would be one that's something possibly less violent and less unethical than stealing women. But they would actually have to go and basically import women because their gender discrepancies were so far off that they would not have enough for people to get married. So I would argue that is one potential societal benefit in terms of this being a lot less immoral is if you say, hey, we've got this discrepancy that we have to actually fix somehow. This is one potential way of fixing it. Not saying it's necessarily justified in all situations, but that could be one way where you would say, well, in this situation, this is where I would skew it a little bit more towards the benefit for society in general. That's a gross simplification, but you have to look at that societal positive or negative in terms of polygamy and how it affects the society in general. I would say it depends on the society's culture. Some cultures are going to be a lot more pro that sort of relationship versus very against that sort of relationship. Some will be more than happy to say we're going to let people just not be married, and well, it stinks for them, but that's how we're going to live our lives because we think that is so much better than having multiple people in a relationship because that's their certain cultural views. So that's one thing that has to be an element of your evaluation of the morality. So it is a complicated topic. I think it varies greatly based on the area and the specific situation. It varies greatly based on sexual preferences and sexual culture. And I think it's going to depend a lot on what is going on in the world or even the region that you're talking about. Some regions, it's even today, if you go into some regions, it's somewhat appropriate or accepted as part of that society, and in some parts it is so utterly rejected that it's frowned upon, illegal, or clearly seen as immoral. But I would say it very much depends. I'm not going to take a hard stance and say, oh, absolutely it's moral or absolutely it's unmoral. But I would say this is one where it definitely depends on the circumstances and the specifics of both the individual couple as a group and as their effect on society in general. So that's it for this lecture. Sorry if it's a little bit long winded. We will be back next week with a new lecture, a new topic. If you guys have any suggestions for any topics you'd like to see, let us know in the comments. I'm Dr. Frank, once again signing off for the Church of Rational Truth. You all have a great day, and bye bye.